Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Tim Newbold, a senior research fellow in the Department of Genetics, Evolution and Environment at University College London. His research group is interested in how and why biodiversity is changing around the world and what this means for human societies. He and his team address these questions using a mix of advanced data analysis and computer modeling and applying their models to make predictions about the future of biodiversity. I welcome Tim Newbold to Savage Minds. It's an honor to have you here because, as you are well aware, the controversies politically around the world around climate change seem to be growing in argumentation pro and against. I'm interested to see how your research might lend more clarity to this issue, especially for people who say that climate change has always happened and that this is nothing worse or greater than has historically been seen. Could you briefly review some of the climate change arguments before we delve into your research?
Sure. So, I'm not a climate scientist myself, but, there is a great consensus among climate scientists that the world is warming and that human actions are driving climate changes far more rapid than we've seen in the past thousands of years. And from my own research, we're already seeing the signal of that climate change on biodiversity. So, for example, some work that we did last year showed that rapid declines in bumblebee biodiversity across North America and Europe can now very clearly be attributed to the effects of climate change over the past 100 years.
There are many people who make the argument, I'm sure you've seen this on Twitter, that there were no records kept before quite recent times on this. How do we know that climate change scientists have it right then?
So we have all sorts of evidence going back over, tens of thousands of years from, lake sediment cores, looking at pollen records that allow us to reconstruct what the climate was going back over tens of thousands of years.
You've been working on the issue of biodiversity and species extinctions. I read a report the other day, this was on major media, not one of yours, that stated that basically 1 in 5 species today is in danger of being extinct within the next 20 years. Is this correct? And what does the science say about this?
Yeah, so we know a lot about certain species, about birds and mammals, reptiles and amphibians. And people have been looking at their status, at their populations over decades now, and it's very, very clear that a great many of those species are at a very high risk of extinction, and so are considered by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature to be at risk of extinction within the next decades. It becomes a little bit harder when we look at things like insects, which are much less studied, but much more monitoring is going on now. And for the groups that we are looking at for insects, it seems as if the pattern is very much the same, that a high fraction, somewhere around a fifth or a quarter of species are threatened with extinction.
Well, that means something for the planet beyond simply that we can no longer look at this rare beetle or mammal. What does this mean for our ecosystem when species start disappearing from the Earth?
Yeah, so we know that a great many functions of natural ecosystems depend on those animals and plants within the ecosystem. So things like nutrient cycling, pollination, seed dispersal, and a lot of my research is looking at those local losses of biodiversity, and we know that as we lose species from ecosystems, then those functions begin to be lost.
Well, in your paper, A Biodiversity Target Based on Species Extinctions, you and your colleagues analyzed the loss of biodiversity and proposed a single target comparable to the 2% climate target, which you maintain could help galvanize biodiversity policy. You write, nationally determined contributions for biodiversity could provide an action-based context for better protection and management of biological resources and provide governments with a framework within which they could act to achieve global biodiversity targets, including to reduce extinction rates. You state also governments also need to monitor the effects of these nationally determined contributions for biodiversity in real time and use models that project into the future to evaluate compliance with policy implementation and fine-tune their policy responses. What would that look like? Are there any governments engaging in your suggestions?
So there are a lot of, there's a lot of action underway to at the scale of national governments to try and arrest biodiversity losses. We've had various targets over the past decades to try and stop losses of biodiversity. But what we don't yet have is a sort of coordinated agreement of national commitments in the same way as we have for climate change, such as countries have been discussing this week. And so what we were proposing here was to greatly simplify the number of targets and to come up with a target that would be easy to communicate to the public, similar to the, as you say, similar to the 2-degree target for climate change. And we settled on extinctions as something that's relatively easy to measure and also has a lot of traction with the public. People are very aware, when there are news stories about species getting extinct.
But there are many, including some of the climate change deniers, who would argue that this is correlation and not causation. What is some evidence that shows the correlation between our use of, let's say, factories that pollute the environment, our use of airplanes, the production of cement, some of which are the greatest contributors to the pollution of the planet, in old speak? What would be some examples to show the causation effect and not that it's correlation?
So we have, countless papers over the past several decades, that very clearly show a fingerprint of habitat loss, of pollution, of climate change in declines of biodiversity. That's it, the evidence is vast.
And are there any groups beyond government? I'm thinking of groups, like I've met many people working in Devon who work on permaculture, satellite cities that try to move away from urban dwelling, working on local community gardens, even individual gardens, where people can reduce their carbon footprint. How would this look like in the scheme of, let's say, governments don't kick into place? What can individuals do to help biodiversity?
Yeah, so there are all sorts of things that we can do. One thing that emerges very clearly from my research and that of others, is that climate change is going to become probably the major problem for biodiversity within the next 30 years. And so, one of the most important things that we can do to preserve biodiversity is to try and meet those climate targets, to reduce the amount of climate change. But we also know that habitat loss, particularly for agriculture, is also, has been the major driver of biodiversity loss and will still be a very important driver in the coming years. And there are lots of things that we can do to reduce that pressure on habitats, from sourcing food from places where biodiversity is a greater consideration, where farming is done in a way that's sensitive to biodiversity, and also, as you say, very local actions like having gardens that are beneficial for biodiversity, planting flowers rather than having concrete, for example.
Are there initiatives by urban planners, architects to perhaps incorporate some of these ideas within their models? Because it seems that the problems can be mitigated by government policy, but we also know that governments are very slow to engage in this, as you've just mentioned. What would let's speak about practical ways that we live today that might have to be rethought. What are some ideas you have in terms of how we live in the world and where we might need to head and move away from currently?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a lot that private companies can do to make their businesses better for biodiversity. As you say, one thing that's one development that's very welcome is that a lot more new buildings now will have green roofs, for example, or living walls, which can really benefit urban biodiversity. At a bigger scale, there are also now moves to have zero deforestation supply chains. So making sure that when companies source materials, they're not contributing to deforestation, particularly of tropical forests that are so rich in biodiversity. So these are really important moves towards better protecting biodiversity.
And I would say choosing elements such as bamboo, perhaps, to build over wood, where bamboo can be replenished much more quickly, no?
Yes. I mean, I don't think we have, all of the information to understand, the biodiversity impacts of different decisions. It can be very complex weighing up biodiversity impacts of different products, especially when there are very complex supply chains involved. But certainly something that's as fast growing as bamboo is likely to be much better than, say, tropical hardwoods from tropical forests.
Your paper on tropical and Mediterranean biodiversity speaks to how land use and climate change are interrelated. Can you explain to our listeners what that means? How we use land today, what it contributes to climate change, and how we might change this?
Yes, so for biodiversity, habitat loss and climate change are creating this sort of perfect storm. These aren't problems that are happening in isolation. And there are sort of two key problems really that lead to this, adding up of the effects of habitat loss and climate change. So one's been known about for quite some time now, and that's that if we chop down habitats, we make it harder for animals and plants to move to keep up with climate change. So we know that with climate change, animals and plants need to move from sort of tropical areas towards higher latitudes, and in mountainous areas they have to move up mountain slopes, and that's much harder to do if we've chopped down the habitats. And then the animals and plants have to move through agricultural landscapes instead of through natural habitats. And the other thing that's going on, and that's something that we're focusing on much more now that has been less studied in the past, is that when we chop down habitats to make agriculture or to make cities, we actually change the climatic conditions in those areas. So agricultural areas and cities are hotter and drier than the natural habitats that they replace. And so this adds on top of the effects of climate change, and so makes it even harder for species to survive.
In this paper, you talk about the potential positive effects of modeling. What are some of these potential positive effects of the models that you use? Because you speak of the various models that assume differences in biodiversity among land uses, which are, as you write, constant across the whole terrestrial surface of the world, although some models have considered tropical, temperate, and taxonomic differences. What are the potential uses of these models and their deficits?
Yeah, so biodiversity models importantly allow us to take that big picture to see what's happening across the world, and they allow us to make predictions about what will happen into the future in the same way that we use climate models to predict what will happen to the global climate. And so, the big problem really that we were tackling with this study is that we tend to take what we know about the places that we've studied the best, and this is often places like North America and Western Europe, and we use that to try and understand what might happen everywhere else. And what was very clear from this particular study that we did is that actually the biodiversity of tropical areas, those areas that we've studied much less, the biodiversity there appears to be much more sensitive to the effects of both habitat loss and climate change. And so this means that we're probably underestimating how much biodiversity will be lost as a result of future habitat loss and climate change.
And are these rather precise measures, or are we still battling older models that refuse to understand the differences of land use by species, as you mentioned in this paper, birds, or the smaller populations that necessitate a change in model? For instance, can you give some examples where one model works better than another with a certain species target?
So this is a really rapidly moving field. Biodiversity models haven't been around as long as climate models. Climate models have been developed since the 1950s. The first things that we would call a biodiversity model appeared in around the 1990s. But this is really rapidly moving now because we know that we've got to tackle the biodiversity losses very urgently. So there's been lots of studies that have developed models for single species, and those can be really quite sophisticated, particularly for those species that we know a lot about, that we have a lot of data for. The sort of work that I do is trying to look at lots of species together. And there, so far, our models have been much simpler. For example, as I said before, taking what we know about what we know from very well studied areas like Western Europe and North America, and then using that to try and understand what's happening everywhere else. So, one of the key things really that we need to understand is what's happening to tropical areas, because they've been much less studied over the past years. But there's going to be a lot of habitat loss in the tropics to meet future food demand. The effects of climate change are likely to be felt most profoundly in the tropics. And so we really need to understand what's happening in those systems.
In your paper, you discuss how tropical species tend to have a slower pace of life, and they also have smaller numbers of offspring, while you write they mature more slowly than other species. So you do look at birds, and you say that they have been shown to confer greater sensitivity to human land use. What we've been shown in major media, the average person who doesn't read your papers, for instance, gets the news of McDonald's being responsible for having so many hectares of Brazil's rainforest mowed down to make room for their cows. Okay. So this is the meta narrative that gets out into popular culture, that the rainforests are being removed to make place for cows for McDonald's hamburgers. What is the media not getting right when they make these types of representations? What are they missing?
Well, so there are a number of features of tropical areas that we think make them particularly that make their biodiversity particularly sensitive to the effects of habitat loss and climate change. And as you say, one of the things is the animals and plants that live there. They tend to be more specialized. They tend to be slower breeding, so they produce less offspring. The other thing is that in places like North America and Europe, we've got a very long history of using the land for agriculture, and so the biodiversity that's found there has had a long time to adapt to humans being within the landscape, we've lost a lot of the biodiversity that would have been there, that was sort of most sensitive to our use of the land. And in tropical areas, we haven't been using the land for as long, and so we've still got all those sorts of sensitive animal and plant species. And then the final thing is that the animals and plants in tropical areas are already close to the limits of the sort of climatic conditions that they can cope with. Tropical systems are already very hot, and so animals and plants are at the upper limits of the sorts of temperatures that they can deal with. And so all of these things come together to mean that the biodiversity in tropical areas is much more sensitive when we start messing around with the climate, when we start messing around with habitats to do agriculture.
And when you say agriculture, you're talking about massive amounts of like large agricultural industries. You're not talking about allotments.
Yes, all things have an impact, of course, but industrialized, very intensive agriculture tends to have a much bigger effect on biodiversity, and of course takes up a much larger area of land than small scale agriculture.
And there are many critics, especially those making arguments for vegetarianism, that a lot of agricultural farming is done in the name of feeding animals. Is there an argument to be made, or that you've seen in your past research, that might indicate that the use of meat as a nutritive substance might be best replaced?
Yeah, so in general, producing meat takes up much more land than producing vegetable products, just because of the inefficiencies in the way that energy moves up food chains, basically. But that's it, in general. So, some systems that produce vegetables can be very impactful on biodiversity, and some systems that produce meat can have a smaller impact. But in general, certainly, producing meat requires more land. And so, shifts in diets from more meat-intensive diets towards more vegetarian diets certainly would reduce the pressure on habitats and so on biodiversity.
And you've just mentioned about the way that biodiversity has been impacted in tropical areas, but you've also done a paper recently with colleagues on biodiversity in Mediterranean biomes. Are there similarities between the tropical and Mediterranean biomes that you have studied?
Yes, so along with tropical areas, the biodiversity of Mediterranean areas also appeared to be very sensitive to the effects of both habitat loss and climate change. And some of the reasons we think are similar. So Mediterranean animals and plants are very specialized. They are living near to the limits of the temperatures with which they can cope. Other things are quite different. So Mediterranean areas do have a very long history, probably the longest history of humans using the land for agriculture. So yes, there are some similarities and also some differences.
Well, I don't know if in the UK you study this as a child. In the US, and we do, when maybe around 7th, 8th grade, we study the older farming methods from the medieval period, where land was laid fallow for a year or two to rejuvenate. Are these older methods perhaps necessary to reinvestigate for present use? Because as you know, instead of laying land fallow today, it's quite often the case that there are products put back into the land so that it can keep producing. And as you probably know as well, people from either the permaculture movement to other named more natural farming movements argue against the uses of chemicals and the need to leave lands to rest.
Yeah, so one thing that's very clear is that while in general, when we convert land to agriculture, we lose biodiversity, the impacts are very variable, and that depends, as you say, on the way that we manage the land. And so, there certainly are better ways of managing land and less good ways of managing land. And certainly chemical inputs often have negative impacts on biodiversity. For example, impacts of pesticides on insects. One thing that emerges from my research as well is the importance of having bits of natural habitat within farmed landscapes. So if we have some patches of natural habitat around, then those farmed landscapes tend to support much more biodiversity.
And there's also other methods of farming. When I was living in Great Britain, I did a lot of work in the areas of Cornwall and Devon, where you have a major research trust, the Agroforestry Research Trust, which examines forest gardening. And there have been many people who have studied forest gardening in southern India, in the states of Karnataka, Kerala. You have quite a bit of these kinds of what in the West people might say is strange, but more traditional farming practices that take place within the forest itself.
Yes, that's right. So yes, agroforestry areas. So as you say, this again, it's an example of where agriculture is interspersed with natural trees or little patches of natural habitat. Can support very high levels of biodiversity. But one of the things though that we wrangle with is finding the right balance between very intensive farming, which takes up a smaller area and so allows us to leave more big areas of natural habitat for biodiversity. Or on the other hand, farming at low intensity, so doing agroforestry, organic farming or whatever. But of course, because the yields are lower, in general, that takes up a larger amount of land. And we still, there's been some work looking at this, where the right balance lies. But there's still a lot of work to be done to, understand this trade-off.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. As you know, since the 1990s, there's been a boost in organic shopping. You have in the US Whole Foods, which many Americans call whole paycheck because it's made an elite product out of organic farming. Well, not just organic farming, but out of organic as an idea, and then skip to organic farming and naturally packaged items, which end up replicating many of the fast food looking items that are already on the shelves. So this becomes both an elite practice where only the wealthiest can have access to that. And it seems that capitalism isn't giving us the responses to what is an urgent subject in terms of the loss of biodiversity today. What would be a good step forward for companies that are looking to actually make an impact on carbon emissions or on biodiversity without resorting to these kinds of high street brands that only the very wealthy can afford?
Yeah, so I think you're right that in order really to tackle biodiversity loss, we've got to find solutions that are affordable for everybody. And I'm not sure, not being an agronomist, I'm not sure exactly what the solutions there are. But yeah, certainly we've got to find things that are socially equitable as well as beneficial for biodiversity.
It's very interesting the way that you look at the land use change in terms of agriculture, because if I've understood what you just said a moment ago, that the choices are often between more intense farming using smaller spaces versus the inverse, which would be maybe less intensive but more land needed. Is there a third solution?
So yes, so this is, there is a sort of general pattern, in the way that we've done agriculture in the past, either we've farmed very intensively and got very high yields, which means that we need a small amount of land, or we've farmed less intensively and got lower yields. But there's a lot of interest in the so-called sustainable intensification, where we might be able to achieve high yields, but do so in a way that's not as damaging to biodiversity. And of course, the other thing is that agriculture actually often needs biodiversity. We need crop pollinators, we need predators that keep pest populations in check. And so, actually it's not necessarily as simple as, either biodiversity or high yields.
Indeed. I think that some of the myths out there about how we can make an impact on the detrimental changes to the earth tend to be either or the idea is it's already been figured out. However, looking at, let's say, when wildflowers were reseeded, and there have been various initiatives within the UK to even fund wildflower seeds so that people can go out and just throw them about. And when these experiments were conducted, we saw that in response to more wildflowers being disseminated, that there was a positive response from the bee population, for instance. And you've written quite a bit on the bee population, and I'm wondering if you could review that for our listeners as to what has happened to the bees over the past 3 decades.
Yes, so certainly habitat loss has been a major pressure on bees, and we've done some work on that, and many others have, and there is a lot that we can do in terms of the way that we manage the land. And as you say, there has tended to be this sort of sense that it's either crop yields or biodiversity. But so far we've been able to farm, and we've lost a lot of biodiversity, but things have still been, we've still been able to pollinate crops. But we're sort of pushing at ecological limits. If we lose enough biodiversity, then we may start to lose these critical functions that natural systems perform for us, like pollination of crops. And on the bees, the work that we did last year was looking also at the effects of climate change. And as I said earlier, there's now a very clear signal of the effects of climate change on bumblebees. And so, this is adding on top of the effects of habitat loss. And so we're likely to see much more rapid declines as climate change accelerates. And again, then we're starting to risk losing those critical functions like pollination, on which our agriculture depends.
And what has contributed to the loss of the bee population? Because, as you well know, there are many arguments around this alone, from the use of neonics to farming. What does the science say to this day on the disappearance of bumblebee populations?
So it seems to be a whole mix of factors. So, certainly people have seen an effect of pesticides on wild bee populations. We've shown this clear effect of climate change, and of course, habitat loss itself has contributed to those declines. And all of these things are adding together, and of course, most of these things are going to increase in their extent. There's going to be more land required for agriculture to feed the growing population and the population with shifting diets. There is, of course, going to be accelerating climate change. And so, all of these things are likely to continue to increase in their intensity in future, which is likely to have very negative effects on bumblebees and of course, other insects as well.
What about the illnesses that bee colonies have been facing? Because they are plagued also by illness.
Yes, I mean, that's not my own area of research, but yes, of course, particularly managed bee colonies, honeybee colonies, are also being affected by disease. And of course, many of these things are linked as well. Changes in climate can change incidence of diseases, for example.
Let's talk about your paper on zoonotic host diversity increases in human-dominated ecosystems. This came out last fall, where you and your colleagues write, land use change, for example, the conversion of natural habitats to agricultural or urban ecosystems is widely recognized to influence the risk and emergence of zoonotic disease in humans. However, whether such changes in risk are underpinned by predictable ecological changes remains unclear. Now, obviously, when I read this paper, I was thinking of the pandemic because, as you know, the current pandemic, the coronavirus disease, is caused by SARS-2, has been classified as a zoonotic disease. Was this in mind while you were all researching and finalizing your project?
So when we started this work, and this was work that was led by a graduate student colleague of ours at UCL, and when he started that work, there was no inkling even of coronavirus on the horizon. So it was, I guess quite surprising then when suddenly coronavirus erupted, and the paper came out around that time, and of course the parallels were very clear. But I guess that really what we were interested in this work, we're seeing these very rapid changes in biodiversity. Not all species lose out. Some things do very well with human impacts, climate change, habitat loss, and so we're really quite interested in what these changes mean for us as humans. One thing that's clear is that we're losing the sort of very specialized animals and plants, and we're gaining the sort of the cosmopolitan, tolerant animals and plants. And what we wanted to find out with this work is whether that means that ecological systems are becoming filled with more things that carry human diseases, and that indeed is what we show, that species that carry human diseases, zoonotic hosts, become much more abundant in areas that we've disturbed for agriculture, and in cities.
Last year, I interviewed a researcher in the US who's done work on this and investigated some theses of students in China who investigated caves near Wuhan to find that there was a theory, and it's still a valid theory floating out there, that the disturbance of, let's say, caves where bats live, even for the sake of sampling them, might be something scientists need to reconsider. Because the thesis was that by disturbing habitat, happily living far away from the city centers and humans with a zoonotic disease might be best left alone and not touched, even for the sake of scientific investigation. Now, this was a theory. It has not yet been proven. But is there something to be said for the way in which humans are interrupting natural habitats and put ourselves at risk of zoonotic disease?
Yes, I mean, certainly as we, as we're clearing natural habitats, we're, coming into contact with animals and with animals that may carry human diseases, certainly.
What is the best way forward for those of us who aren't in government or don't own massive factories to maybe make policy changes even within the private sector? What are things that the average person can do to make an impact on supporting biodiversity?
So I'd say one of the key things really, so there are sort of very local actions that we can take in the way that we manage our own land, our gardens and green spaces. But more generally as consumers, a key thing is to be aware of where ingredients are coming that make our products. And there are now moves afoot to make it much easier for people to understand the likely biodiversity impacts of products that we buy. More and more companies are talking about zero deforestation supply chains. Governments talking about zero deforestation supply chains. And so, making sure that we buy products that are produced in a sustainable manner is really one of the key things we could do. And of course, contributing as much as we can to reducing climate change, because that is going to be the major pressure on biodiversity within the next few decades. And so anything that we can do to reduce levels of climate change will be beneficial for biodiversity.
Well, yes, speaking back to the Whole Foods and high-end shops that cater to people who are ostensibly climate change conscious, is the emergence of replacements within the vegan market, for instance. The replacement for butter is this palm oil spread. I investigated that a few years ago because, as you probably are aware, the palm trees that have been planted all over Malaysia and Borneo specifically have destroyed vast tracts of the jungle there. All this, it's the paradox, Tim, that people are saying they want to help climate change, but end up getting on board with a new marketing device such as palm oil spread. So you don't have to have cow milk in your diet, but instead, this has contributed to the wholesale destruction of jungles throughout Malaysia. So it's almost a paradox that the very industries that claim to be fighting climate change are in fact contributing to them.
Yes, so there are some complexities, definitely, and it's worth being aware that climate change isn't the only contributor of biodiversity loss, and palm oil certainly is a major pressure on tropical ecosystems, and so thinking about products that have palm oil in, looking for the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil logo on foods, is a good way to be thinking about impacts of habitat loss.
And where does your research take you in the future now? You're working with modeling and looking at predictable measures for environmental and biodiversity changes. What do you see on the horizon in your field?
Yeah, so we're interested in a few things. One is this perfect storm that I talked about of habitat loss and climate change. That is still this sort of complex, these complex effects of both habitat loss and climate change are still something that we don't capture very well within our models and our forecasts for what might happen to biodiversity. We're also interested in the impacts of international trade. So we've talked a few times about supply chains and what that means for biodiversity. So we're really interested in sort of tracing the impacts on biodiversity through trade in commodities, looking at the impacts.
And what has your research shown thus far on this impact?
So we're still this is something that we're still working on, but one thing that's already emerging is that the impacts of trade on climate aren't necessarily the same as impacts of trade on biodiversity, which we think is a really interesting finding, because there's lots of talk, as you say, about replacing products in order to reduce their impacts on climate. That may not always be the best thing for biodiversity, but that's something that we're still working on. I should say that, and the third thing that we're really interested in is this, understanding which animals and plants we're losing and what that means for us. So we've got a lot of work looking at pollinators and how they are being affected by habitat loss and climate change, to try and understand, what biodiversity changes might mean for us through, pollination of crops, for example.
And the importance of pollination, for instance, we discussed bees earlier. What are some of the other animals that contribute to pollination? And in the evidence, the stark evidence that there are real threats to current pollination vehicles, let's call it, what is an alternative to this? Because it's not like everyone can run out and just throw wildflower seeds everywhere and hope that takes care of it. The situation's much more stark than simply lack of wildflowers in Britain.
Yes, definitely. So all sorts of things contribute to pollination. Bees, of course, that many people know about. Wasps do as well. Butterflies and moths, flies, and also mammals and birds. So, for example, agave, which is one of the key ingredients of tequila, is pollinated by a bat. And what our research is showing is that pollinators do very badly with very intensive farming, and particularly in tropical areas. So we've got some work coming out within the next 2 or 3 weeks that shows that intensive farming in the tropics has a very negative impact on pollinators. And as I said before, often we're taking what we see in Europe and North America and using that to understand what might happen elsewhere. But this is showing that the impacts on pollinators may be even more acute in tropical regions than has been suggested by research in Europe and North America.
And have you done any work on one of the most fascinating biodiverse sites in the UK for me are the hedgerows? I'm a bit obsessed with hedgerows because, as you know, they have a long history in farming, but many of the hedgerows in England are very old. And you'll find within them, and they look like at first glance, you think there's a wall underneath some of them, but they're not. They've just been there for hundreds of years, and they have many species of flora living together. And then many types of animals living in and among them, to include bees that often use that as their beeline. Can you speak a bit about how agriculture in and around hedgerows might offer solutions or not?
Yeah, so we know that hedgerows are one of these sort of features of agricultural areas that can be very beneficial for biodiversity. So when we talk about intensive farming, which is particularly detrimental to biodiversity, there are a number of features of that, high input of chemicals, just growing one type of crop over a large area, and removal of bits of natural habitat like hedgerows. And so conversely, having things like hedgerows or patches of natural habitat or natural trees within an agricultural system can have a very positive effect on biodiversity.
One thing I noticed also while doing farming in Cornwall were the abundance of communities where people were trying to get back to more natural farming. And the debate, even amongst the permaculturalists, was let's look again at the situation of using pesticides, which ones might be less toxic to the environment, more natural, because the argument amongst some were simply some pesticides come from naturally found chemicals. Okay, so that's one argument. And the other was it's more important to buy locally and not worry about pesticides as much. We're focusing on the wrong issue. We need to work on not buying fruit that comes from South Africa and buy fruit that comes within a certain radius of where we live.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the challenge is that we have to find solutions that will scale up. The size of the problem is so immense. We've got a population that may reach 10 billion by the middle of the century, and we've got to find solutions to agriculture that will scale up and will allow us to feed human populations. And I think we can learn a lot from some of these things, from being more precise about the way that we use chemicals, using things that are less detrimental to biodiversity, incorporating bits of natural habitat, but ultimately to to stop losses of biodiversity, we've got to find solutions that can be used across the globe.
Can you just tell us a bit about how the Convention on Biodiversity might be useful going forward, or might there be need for other kinds of bodies that offer more proactive solutions that might not have to wait another decade or two to put into gear actions that move us towards embracing the changes and the challenges of biodiversity today?
I mean, the Convention on Biological Diversity plays an essential role, and critically in getting governments to agree on targets for biodiversity loss. So, currently the negotiations are underway to agree the next set of targets, the post 2020 targets, but ultimately it's governments that have to take action. Similar to as with climate change, these agreements can be reached, and then countries have to set their own targets and to put in place the actions that are needed. And of course, also there's a role for private companies, as we've discussed, in reducing biodiversity impacts of their supply chains, and also us as individuals, both as consumers and in the way that we manage our own green spaces, our gardens, and so forth.
The living wall, when you mentioned that earlier, I thought of this living wall in the middle of Madrid, which is more aesthetic than it is pragmatic. There's no garden for food growing on that wall. But I'm wondering if viable solutions, obviously in cities, most people are living in flats. But if there are viable solutions for people living even in smaller towns where they might have a little backyard to use. Obviously, not everyone wants to go to farming. I mean, a lot of people think, we're moving forward. We shouldn't be having to farm. We've got a full-time job. But it seems that with the population heading towards an explosion in future years, that we need to start addressing how we as individuals can make a dent. For instance, I live in a flat. I grew some watercress recently. We had it last night for dinner. Are there ways that you have seen communities work positively in addressing en masse the biodiversity issue through just how they affect climate change? Because obviously by affecting climate change, you can often help the biodiversity. And obviously, I'm not thinking everyone will make a big dent by growing watercress on their windowsill, but what are some of the positive examples you've seen out there that we might ought to emulate?
Yeah, I mean, individual actions are small, but of course, collectively they add up. And I think as I said, key things really would be actions that reduce our carbon footprints and ultimately reduce climate change. And just thinking about what we grow in our gardens, because particularly for insects, having flowers rather than concrete is much better for insects. And yes, as consumer choices as well are very important. The more that we can make responsible choices when we buy food and other products, again, individually it's small, but collectively it can add up to having a big effect.